At 23:40 on December 29, 1944, the monotone ping of radar echoed through the cramped cockpit of a P-61 Black Widow as Major Atticus Thornfield watched 12 glowing dots materialize on his scope like malevolent stars against the darkness above Muro Field, Philippines. 26 years old, flying alone, 90 minutes of fuel, and 20,000 American troops sleeping in tents below who had no idea their lives depended on what happened in the next hour and 20 minutes. The twin Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engines hummed with restrained power as Thornfield adjusted his headset and studied the formation approaching from the north. 12 Japanese bombers spread across an 8-mile front, heading directly toward the construction crews working through the night to complete the airfield that would support the Lingayen Gulf invasion. No radar operator in the seat behind him. No wingman flanking his starboard. Just him, the experimental SCR-720 radar that half his squadron didn't trust, and a tactical situation that doctrine said was impossible to win. But Major Atticus Thornfield saw something in that radar scope that only a mortician's son could recognize. The formation wasn't random. It was arranged like corpses in a funeral parlor, deliberately staged to create a specific impression. Someone had positioned those bombers with the precision of a man who understood death intimately, and that someone was trying to kill him. Thornfield had grown up in Blackwood and Sons Funeral Home in Montpelier, Vermont, where his father had taught him that bodies told stories if you knew how to listen. The way a corpse's hands were positioned revealed whether they'd fought their attacker. The angle of a head showed the direction of impact. The expression frozen on dead features could tell you whether death had come as surprise, acceptance, or terror. For 18 years, young Atticus had learned to read death like other boys learn to read baseball box scores. Now, staring at 12 radar contacts arranged in a pattern that made his funeral home instincts crawl, he realized someone on the other side understood killing just as intimately as he understood dying. The Japanese formation leader had positioned his bombers like a funeral director arranging bodies for maximum emotional impact. Closest targets to draw attention, secondary threats positioned to exploit predictable responses, and somewhere in that formation, the real killers waiting for their moment. The fuel gauge showed full tanks, 646 gallons, enough for 90 minutes of combat flying at normal power settings. 90 minutes to intercept 12 targets spread across terrain that would require 5 to 8 minutes between engagements. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Even if every shot killed, even if every intercept was perfect, he could realistically engage 3 bombers, maybe 4 if he pushed his luck and his fuel consumption to dangerous limits. 8 bombers would get through. 8 bombers meant dead construction crews, destroyed equipment, delayed airfield completion, and a compromised invasion timeline that could cost thousands of American lives at Lingayen Gulf. The weight of those calculations pressed against his chest like the lid of a coffin he'd helped his father close too many times. Fellow pilots had always found Thornfield unsettling, though they couldn't articulate exactly why. Captain Morrison called it his death sense, the way Thornfield could look at a pilot before a mission and somehow know who wouldn't return. Other airmen avoided him in the ready room, making excuses not to fly, as his wingman whispered that he measured them for coffins with his eyes. They weren't wrong. Growing up among the dead had given him an intuitive understanding of mortality that made living men uncomfortable. But tonight, that same ability might be the only thing standing between sleeping Americans and Japanese high explosives. The radar scope showed the bomber formation maintaining course and altitude, flying in what appeared to be a standard attack approach. Appeared to be. Thornfield's funeral home training had taught him that appearances were usually designed to deceive. A corpse positioned to look peaceful might hide signs of violence. A family's grief might mask relief at an inheritance. And a bomber formation that looked straightforward might conceal something far more dangerous. He reached for the radio switch to contact ground control, then hesitated. What could he tell them? That his death sense was tingling? That the enemy formation reminded him of bodies arranged for a viewing? Ground control wanted facts, vectors, altitudes, not the intuitive dread of a mortician's son who'd spent his childhood learning that death always had a plan. Instead, he pushed the throttles forward and felt the Black Widow surge into the night sky. Whatever trap was waiting up there, he'd have to spring it himself and hope his unusual education in mortality would keep him alive long enough to protect the men sleeping below. The P-61 climbed at 2,000 feet per minute, its twin booms cutting through the humid Philippine air as Thornfield divided his attention between flying the aircraft and operating the radar. Normally, Lieutenant Porter would be sitting in the compartment behind him, managing the scope while Thornfield focused on flying. But Porter was lying in a hospital bed at the base medical facility, recovering from injuries sustained when a construction crane had collapsed during runway expansion work the previous afternoon. "You see death better alone anyway," Captain Morrison had said when assigning Thornfield the solo mission. Morrison meant it as practical assessment rather than insult. The captain had watched Thornfield's uncanny ability to predict casualties for 8 months and had learned to trust instincts he didn't understand. Now, climbing toward an engagement that should require a full crew, Thornfield found himself grateful for the solitude. No one else to worry about, no one else whose death he might accidentally foresee. Just him, the radar, and whatever lethal puzzle the Japanese had constructed in the darkness above. At 8,000 feet, he leveled off and began his approach toward the bomber formation. The radar showed them maintaining course, still 8 miles north of Muro Field, flying at various altitudes between 6,000 and 10,000 feet. Not the tight formation typical of Japanese bombing raids, this group was spread vertically and horizontally, forcing any intercepting fighter to choose targets rather than engage a concentrated formation. Smart tactics, deadly tactics, the kind of thinking that belonged to someone who understood how American night fighters operated and had developed specific countermeasures. Thornfield had read intelligence reports about Japanese aces who studied enemy doctrine, learned weaknesses, and exploited them ruthlessly. He was about to meet one of them. The first radar contact solidified at 6 miles. A single bomber flying straight and level at 9,000 feet, slightly ahead of the main formation. Perfect target for a night fighter pilot looking for an easy kill. Too perfect. Thornfield's funeral home instincts screamed warning. In his father's business, anything that looked too easy usually was. Families who seemed eager to bury relatives quickly often had something to hide. Corpses positioned too peacefully often concealed violence. This bomber was positioned too conveniently, flying too predictably, offering itself too obviously. Bait. Someone wanted him to take that target first, to commit his time and fuel to an engagement designed to exhaust his resources, while more dangerous threats proceeded undetected toward their real objectives. Before we watch this mortician's son become the Pacific's most feared night hunter, we'd love to know, where around the world are you experiencing this story? Drop your location in the comments and let's see how far these forgotten heroes' legacies have traveled. But understanding the trap didn't eliminate the dilemma. 12 bombers were approaching American positions. Even if 11 of them were decoys designed to waste his time, one bomber carrying real ordnance could kill dozens of construction workers. He couldn't ignore any target completely. He had to engage, but he needed to choose targets based on threat assessment rather than proximity. Thornfield adjusted his approach angle and began scanning the formation with the practiced eye his father had trained on countless corpses. Look for inconsistencies, notice what doesn't belong, pay attention to details others miss. In the funeral business, those skills meant the difference between truth and deception. In night fighting, they meant the difference between saving lives and watching bombs fall on sleeping Americans. The formation's arrangement began to make sense as he studied it. The obvious target flying alone was designed to draw attention. Behind it, 3 bombers flew in loose formation, close enough to support each other but spread enough to force multiple intercepts. Further back, another group of 4 aircraft maintained position, probably the real threat carriers. And scattered throughout, individual bombers flying at different altitudes, creating the impression of chaos while actually providing systematic coverage. Someone very intelligent had planned this raid, someone who understood exactly how American radar-equipped night fighters would respond to different target presentations. Someone who'd studied P-61 fuel consumption, intercept times, and tactical doctrine. The Japanese formation leader wasn't just a pilot, he was a strategist, and he was hunting Thornfield as deliberately as Thornfield was hunting him. Range closed to 4 miles. Thornfield could see the first bomber clearly on his scope now, steady and unwavering, maintaining perfect course and altitude. Still too convenient, still obviously bait. But as he watched, 2 more contacts appeared on his radar, breaking away from the main formation and heading toward different vectors. The trap was evolving, becoming more complex, forcing him to make decisions based on incomplete information. Classic misdirection. In the funeral business, families often employed similar tactics when trying to conceal cause of death. Present an obvious explanation to distract from more complicated truths. Make the investigator focus on harmless details while missing critical evidence. Force quick decisions based on limited information. But Thornfield had learned patience from 18 years of dealing with grieving families who lied, insurance investigators who pressed for quick conclusions, and coroners who wanted simple explanations for complicated deaths. Patience and careful observation always revealed truth, even when truth was deliberately hidden. He adjusted his intercept course toward the second group of bombers, the ones flying in loose formation behind the obvious bait. If this was a layered trap, the second layer might reveal the true structure of the attack, range 3 miles in closing. The radio crackled to life with ground control's voice, tinny and distorted through the helmet speakers. Night Hunter 1, we show multiple contacts approaching from the north. Advise intercept status. Night Hunter 1, engaging multiple targets, Thornfield replied, keeping his voice steady despite the complexity of what he was seeing on the radar scope. Formation appears to be a stepped altitude attack, counting 12 aircraft, various vectors. Copy, Night Hunter 1. Construction crews have been alerted but cannot suspend operations. Airfield completion critical for invasion timeline. Which meant that even if Thornfield managed to intercept most of the bombers, any that got through would find brightly lit targets. Construction crews working through the night with floodlights, heavy equipment, and fuel dumps clearly visible from altitude. Perfect bombing conditions for any aircraft that reached the target zone, range 2 miles. The second group of bombers maintained formation, but Thornfield noticed something that made his death sense tingle. These aircraft were flying lower and slower than the obvious bait, characteristics that suggested heavier bomb loads, real ordnance rather than propaganda leaflets or minimal payloads designed to waste interceptor time. He'd found the killers. Thornfield banked the P-61 into an intercept course and armed his cannon. 4 20mm Hispano cannons mounted in the lower fuselage, 800 rounds total, enough for approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. But night fighter doctrine called for short, precise bursts. Get close, fire, confirm kill, move to the next target. No time for extended combat when multiple threats required attention. At 1 mile, he could see the lead bomber visually, a dark shape against slightly less dark clouds. Mitsubishi G4M, designated Betty by American intelligence. Twin engine, 7-man crew, bomb load capacity of 3,520 pounds, more than enough explosive power to devastate a construction site filled with fuel trucks and ammunition storage. Range decreased rapidly, 800 yards, 700, 600. Betty's crew showed no indication they'd detected his approach. No evasive maneuvers, no defensive fire, no indication they knew death was approaching from below and behind. At 400 yards, Thornfield centered the target in his gun sight and prepared to fire. His finger rested on the trigger as the bomber grew larger in his sight picture. 1 burst should be sufficient. The Betty's fuel tanks weren't self-sealing, and 20mm high explosive rounds would turn the aircraft into a fireball. But as his finger began to squeeze the trigger, his radar scope showed something that made him hesitate. The remaining bombers were reacting to his position, adjusting course and altitude, spreading into a wider formation. Someone in that group was coordinating their response, directing them based on his current engagement, which meant someone was watching, someone with radio communication to the other aircraft, someone who was using this engagement to gather intelligence about American night fighter tactics, response times, and capabilities. He was being studied as much as he was hunting. Thornfield fired a 2-second burst at 350 yards range. The tracers arced toward the Betty like deadly fireworks, and he watched the shells impact along the bomber's right wing and engine nacelle. Fuel erupted in orange flame, spreading rapidly across the wing surface. The bomber rolled right and entered a steep dive, streaming fire and debris. 1 kill confirmed, 11 targets remaining. The fuel gauge showed 87%. Time elapsed since initial contact, 4 minutes and 30 seconds. As he pulled away from the burning bomber, Thornfield's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission, not from ground control, not from any American frequency. The voice was clear, speaking accented English with deliberate precision. Very good, American Night Hunter. Clean kill, proper technique, exactly what our intelligence predicted. But you have chosen the wrong target first. My real bombers carry gifts for your sleeping construction crews, and they are not where your doctrine says they should be." The transmission ended, leaving Thornfield alone with the unsettling realization that someone in the Japanese formation spoke fluent English and wanted him to know this was personal. Not just a strategic bombing raid, an intellectual duel between pilots who understood each other's capabilities. 11 bombers still heading for 20,000 sleeping Americans, 70 minutes of fuel remaining. What's your move? Tell us in the comments how you'd handle this impossible situation. Thornfield scanned his radar scope with new understanding. The formation he'd been reading as a tactical deployment was actually a psychological test. Someone was measuring his responses, learning his decision-making patterns, preparing to exploit whatever weaknesses he revealed. But that same someone had made a critical error. He'd revealed himself as the formation leader through his radio transmission. Now Thornfield knew which aircraft held the intelligence directing this attack. And more importantly, he knew that someone in that formation understood death as intimately as he did. This wasn't just a bombing raid anymore. It was a contest between two men who'd studied killing from different perspectives, and only one of them would see sunrise. The fuel gauge showed 83% as Thornfield turned toward the remaining formation. Somewhere in that group of 11 aircraft, a Japanese pilot was orchestrating an attack designed to kill American construction workers and delay the invasion that could end the war. But that same pilot had just made the mistake of making this personal. And making it personal with a mortician's son who'd learned from childhood that death always revealed its secrets to those patient enough to look carefully. The real hunt was just beginning. Thornfield adjusted his radar scope and began analyzing the remaining bomber formation with the systematic approach his father had taught him for examining suspicious deaths. Look for patterns. Notice inconsistencies. Pay attention to what others overlook, and remember that the truth was usually hidden in plain sight, disguised as something harmless. 10 aircraft were spread across a 6-mile front, flying at altitudes ranging from 7,000 to 12,000 feet. But one aircraft, flying alone at 11,000 feet, maintained a position that allowed visual contact with all other bombers in the formation. Command position. The aircraft directed the attack through radio communication. That's where the intelligence was. That's where the real threat originated. But as Thornfield began his approach toward the command aircraft, his radar scope showed the remaining 9 bombers executing a complex maneuver that spread them across an even wider front. Instead of maintaining formation, they were dispersing to individual attack vectors, each bomber heading toward different sections of the American airfield complex. Simultaneous attack from multiple directions, no way for a single night fighter to intercept all targets. Some bombers would inevitably reach their objectives, and the construction crews working under floodlights would pay the price for what was becoming a very personal contest between two pilots who understood killing too well. The fuel gauge showed 79%. 15 minutes of combat flying had consumed 11% of his fuel, slightly ahead of projected consumption, but within acceptable limits. However, the dispersed formation meant longer intercept times, higher fuel consumption, and difficult targeting decisions. Classic resource exhaustion strategy. Force the defender to make impossible choices between multiple threats, ensuring some attacks succeed regardless of interceptor skill. Thornfield recognized the tactic because it mirrored approaches he'd seen families use when trying to conceal complicated deaths. Overwhelm investigators with multiple explanations, force quick decisions, exploit the impossibility of examining every detail thoroughly. But funeral home work had also taught him that complex deceptions usually contained fundamental flaws. People trying to hide the truth often revealed more than they intended. The effort required to maintain multiple false explanations usually created inconsistencies that careful observation could exploit. He needed to stop thinking like a fighter pilot responding to immediate threats and start thinking like a funeral director investigating suspicious circumstances. What was this formation really trying to accomplish? What were they trying to hide? And what had the command pilot revealed through his radio transmission that could be used against him? The transmission itself was revealing. Fluent English suggested either extensive intelligence training or personal familiarity with American culture. The tone was confident, but also personally engaging, as if the speaker wanted to establish individual connection rather than simply coordinate military action. and the content revealed specific knowledge of American night fighter doctrine that went beyond routine intelligence gathering. Someone in that command aircraft had studied P-61 operations extensively, possibly through captured documents, interrogated pilots, or direct observation of previous engagements. Someone who understood American tactical responses well enough to design specific countermeasures. Someone who was personally invested in this engagement beyond simple mission requirements. Thornfield had encountered similar psychological profiles in his funeral home work. Killers who wanted recognition for their intelligence, murderers who couldn't resist demonstrating their superiority over investigators, people who'd planned elaborate crime and needed acknowledgement for their cleverness, even from their intended victims. The Japanese formation leader wanted Thornfield to understand how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered, which meant he also wanted Thornfield to live long enough to appreciate his defeat. Classic psychological weakness. The need for recognition often compromised operational security, and operational security was exactly what Thornfield needed to exploit. He adjusted his approach toward a bomber flying alone at 8,000 feet, one of the aircraft that had broken away from the main formation. But instead of committing to the intercept immediately, he maintained distance and began tracking the aircraft's course. Where was it actually heading? What target had it been assigned? The bomber's flight path projected toward the southern section of Muro Field, where fuel storage tanks and ammunition dumps were located. High-value target, maximum destruction potential, but also heavily defended with anti-aircraft batteries that made low-level bombing extremely dangerous. Suicide mission unless the pilot had specific intelligence about gun positions, searchlight patterns, and defensive procedures, intelligence that could only come from extensive reconnaissance or inside information about American defensive preparations. This bomber wasn't just carrying ordnance, it was carrying someone who knew Muro Field intimately, possibly someone who'd been observing American operations for weeks or months. Someone whose capture might provide crucial intelligence about Japanese reconnaissance capabilities. But as Thornfield positioned himself for intercept, his radar scope showed the command aircraft beginning a descent toward American positions. The formation leader wasn't content to direct attacks from safe altitude. He was joining the bombing run personally, probably carrying the most important payload himself. Decision time. Pursue the intelligence target that might provide future security advantages, or intercept the command aircraft that posed immediate threat to construction crews. Save American lives tonight or prevent future attacks through captured intelligence, personal tactical victory, or strategic intelligence opportunity. The fuel gauge showed 75%. Time was becoming critical. Every minute spent analyzing options was another minute closer to fuel exhaustion that would force him to return to base, regardless of how many bombers remained in the attack formation. Thornfield had learned from 18 years of funeral home work that overthinking often led to paralysis when decisive action was required. Sometimes you have to trust instincts developed through experience and make the hard choice without complete information. His instincts, trained by childhood exposure to death and refined by months of combat flying, told him that the command aircraft posed the greatest immediate threat. Not because of its bomb load, but because of its commander's intelligence and adaptability. Someone that smart, directing future attacks, could kill far more Americans than any single bomber load. He turned the P-61 toward the descending command aircraft and pushed the throttles to combat power. Time for intellectual analysis had ended. Time for killing had begun. But as he closed range toward the command aircraft, Thornfield realized that someone in that bomber was probably making identical calculations about him, studying his tactics, learning his decision-making patterns, preparing countermeasures for their next encounter. Because there would be a next encounter. Personal challenges between pilots who understood killing as intimately as they did rarely ended with single engagements. The radar scope showed the command aircraft at 7,000 feet, descending toward bombing altitude. Range 4 miles and closing rapidly. Fuel at 72%. 9 other bombers scattered across the night sky, heading toward various targets on Muro Field. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, a Japanese pilot was waiting to see if the American night hunter was as good at killing as he was at analyzing death. Range closed to 3 miles as Thornfield locked his radar on the descending command aircraft. But something in the bomber's flight pattern made him hesitate. The aircraft wasn't flying the direct approach typical of a bombing run. Instead, it was weaving slightly, making subtle course corrections that suggested evasive action against a threat the pilot couldn't see. The Japanese commander knew he was being hunted. More concerning, the bomber's altitude and heading projected toward the most heavily defended section of Muro Field. No experienced pilot would approach anti-aircraft batteries without specific intelligence about gun positions and firing patterns. Unless destroying those defenses was worth the risk, or unless someone had provided detailed reconnaissance about American defensive capabilities, Thornfield's funeral home instincts screamed warning. Something about this engagement felt wrong, too deliberate, too much like the elaborate deceptions families sometimes constructed to hide embarrassing deaths. The command aircraft might be bait designed to draw him into a more sophisticated trap than the obvious decoy he'd already destroyed. But as he analyzed the tactical situation, his radar scope showed two other bombers approaching Muro Field from different vectors. Both were flying at low altitude, below effective radar detection range for ground controllers. Both were heading toward sections of the airfield where construction crews were working under bright lights, real attack aircraft with real bombs heading for real targets while he debated the psychology of their commander. Decision made. Thornfield armed his cannons and dove toward the nearest low-altitude bomber, abandoning his pursuit of the command aircraft. Saving construction crews took precedence over capturing enemy commanders regardless of intelligence value. The target was another Mitsubishi G4M flying at 4,000 feet, maintaining course toward the fuel storage area where dozens of trucks and several thousand gallons of aviation gasoline created a target that would burn for days if hit. Range 2 miles and closing rapidly as Thornfield descended from 7,000 feet. At 1 mile, his radio crackled with the familiar accented voice. "Interesting choice, American pilot. You sacrificed the source to save the targets. Tactically correct but strategically short-sighted. I will remember this preference for future planning." The transmission confirmed what Thornfield had suspected. The Japanese commander was using this engagement as a learning exercise, gathering intelligence about American decision-making under pressure. Every choice Thornfield made was being analyzed, recorded, and filed away for use against future night fighter operations. But the same radio discipline that allowed the enemy commander to gather intelligence also revealed his position. Voice transmission required line-of-sight communication or radio relay, which meant the command aircraft was still within range and actively coordinating the attack. Thornfield filed that information for later use and concentrated on the immediate intercept. Range 800 yards. The bomber crew had spotted his approach and was taking evasive action, turning hard left and diving toward lower altitude. Standard defensive maneuver, but one that brought the aircraft closer to American anti-aircraft positions. The bomber pilot was choosing between two types of death: fighter interception or ground fire. Classic tactical dilemma that Thornfield recognized from his funeral work. Sometimes people faced with inevitable death chose how they wanted to die, maintaining control over their final moments even when they couldn't control the outcome. At 600 yards, Thornfield fired his first burst, 2-second duration, 48 rounds from 4 cannons. The tracers reached out toward the diving bomber, but the target's evasive maneuvers threw off his aim. The shells passed behind the aircraft, sparking harmlessly in the night air. The bomber continued its dive, now at 2,000 feet, and approaching the altitude where ground fire would become effective. But it was also approaching the altitude where accurate bombing became possible. If the crew completed their attack run, fuel trucks and aviation gasoline would create secondary explosions that could destroy half the construction equipment on the field. Thornfield adjusted his dive angle and closed to 400 yards. The bomber was trapped between his pursuit and the ground defenses below, forced to choose between immediate death from fighter attack or probable death from anti-aircraft fire. But trapped aircraft often became desperate, and desperate bomber crews sometimes accomplished their missions through sheer determination. He fired again. 3-second burst, 72 rounds. This time his aim was accurate. 20-millimeter shells tore through the bomber's right engine and wing structure. Fuel ignited immediately, spreading orange flame across the wing surface. The aircraft rolled inverted and dove toward the jungle south of the airfield, streaming fire and debris. 2 kills confirmed, 10 targets remaining. The fuel gauge showed 68%. But as he pulled up from the diving attack, Thornfield's radio received another transmission that made his blood freeze, not the accented English of the Japanese commander. American voice, ground control, emergency frequency. All aircraft, construction crews under direct attack. Repeat, bombs falling on fuel storage area, heavy casualties reported, immediate assistance required. He'd been outmaneuvered. While engaging the low-altitude bomber, other aircraft from the formation had reached their targets. The intellectual duel with the Japanese commander had cost American lives, exactly as intended. Rage built in Thornfield's chest, the cold fury he'd learned to control during 18 years of dealing with families who'd killed relatives and tried to cover it with lies. But this time, the lies had resulted in dead construction workers instead of insurance fraud, and the killer was still airborne, still coordinating attacks, still using American deaths to gather intelligence for future operations. The radio crackled again with the familiar accented voice, but now the tone carried satisfaction rather than clinical analysis. 7 bombers remaining, American pilot, and now you understand the cost of engaging individual targets instead of disrupting command structure. Each minute you spend hunting followers allows me to direct the remaining aircraft more effectively. Psychological warfare designed to provoke emotional responses that would compromise tactical judgment. Thornfield recognized the technique from his funeral work, where killers often tried to manipulate investigators through guilt, anger, or frustration. The goal was always the same: force mistakes that would allow the guilty party to escape consequences. But this killer had made an error. He'd revealed too much satisfaction in American deaths, too much personal investment in the psychological impact of his tactics. Professional military commanders maintained emotional distance from their operations. Personal vendettas created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Thornfield checked his fuel gauge, 64%, enough for perhaps 4 more intercepts if he managed fuel consumption carefully. 7 bombers remaining meant he couldn't save everyone, but he could make the Japanese commander pay personally for the Americans who'd already died. His radar scope showed the command aircraft climbing back to 8,000 feet, resuming coordination duties after its brief descent toward bombing altitude. Range 6 miles and increasing as the bomber moved away from American defensive positions. But it was also moving away from the remaining attack aircraft, suggesting the commander felt safe enough to observe from a distance rather than provide close tactical control, confidence, or overconfidence. In Thornfield's experience, people who felt too safe often became careless about security measures that had kept them alive. He turned toward the command aircraft and pushed his throttles to combat power. Time to make this personal for the Japanese commander who'd just used American deaths for psychological manipulation. The range closed rapidly as Thornfield climbed toward the command aircraft. 5 miles, 4 miles, 3 miles. But at 2 miles, something unexpected appeared on his radar scope. The command aircraft wasn't alone. 2 other bombers had joined formation with it, creating a defensive triangle that would make intercept far more dangerous. Escort formation. The Japanese commander had learned from the previous engagements and was no longer operating as an isolated target. Professional adaptation to changing tactical conditions, exactly what Thornfield would expect from someone intelligent enough to design tonight's complex attack. But escort formations created communication requirements that revealed information about command structure, target priorities, and future tactical intentions. Thornfield's funeral home training had taught him that group conspiracies always revealed more evidence than individual crimes. Multiple people coordinating deception inevitably created inconsistencies that careful analysis could exploit. He adjusted his approach angle to attack from below and behind, using the P-61's black paint scheme to maintain concealment against the dark sky. Range 1 mile. The 3 aircraft maintained tight formation, but their positioning revealed which bomber carried the actual commander. The center aircraft flew slightly ahead, with the escort bombers positioned to protect it from fighter attack while maintaining communication links. Classic command formation. The intelligence he needed was in that center aircraft. At 800 yards, Thornfield armed his cannons and prepared to engage. But his radio crackled with an unexpected transmission: American frequency, emergency priority. Night Hunter 1, 3 bombers approaching from the southeast, low altitude, heavy payloads confirmed. Construction crews evacuate but need immediate intercept to prevent total mission failure. 3 more bombers. The Japanese commander had held a reserve force, probably launched after the initial attack to exploit whatever gaps the first wave created. Professional tactics, layered assault, exactly what Thornfield should have expected from someone sophisticated enough to design tonight's operation. But it also meant the formation he was currently engaging might be another diversion, designed to draw him away from the real threat while reserve bombers completed the mission to destroy American construction capabilities. The fuel gauge showed 59%. Enough for maybe 3 more intercepts, certainly not enough to engage all remaining targets. He had to choose between pursuing the command aircraft that had orchestrated American deaths or intercepting the reserve bombers that threatened to complete the mission. Save lives now, or prevent future operations by eliminating their commander. Immediate tactical requirements versus long-term strategic objectives, the kind of decision that kept Thornfield awake during his funeral home days, when families forced him to choose between revealing painful truths or protecting feelings that would ultimately lead to more pain. If you're still with us at this point, you understand this isn't just about aerial combat. It's about one man's dark gift saving thousands of sleeping soldiers. Honor Major Thornfield's legacy by leaving a salute emoji in the comments below. But as Thornfield wrestled with the decision, his radar scope showed the command aircraft beginning another descent toward bombing altitude. The Japanese commander wasn't withdrawing to a safe distance. He was rejoining the attack personally, probably carrying the most important payload himself. That changed everything. The reserve bombers might be a diversion to draw attention away from the command aircraft's final attack. Or the command aircraft might be sacrificing itself to ensure the reserve bombers completed their mission. Complex deception, layered on complex deception, exactly the kind of psychological maze that had made some of his funeral home investigations nearly impossible to solve. But one thing his father had taught him about complicated cases: when everything becomes confusing, focus on the most dangerous immediate threat. Worry about long-term consequences after you've dealt with short-term survival. The command aircraft diving toward bombing altitude represented the most immediate danger, not because of its bomb load, but because of its commander's demonstrated ability to coordinate attacks that killed Americans. Eliminating that intelligence would disrupt whatever final phase of the operation was still unfolding. Thornfield rolled the P-61 into a diving attack and targeted the command aircraft. Range decreased rapidly as both fighters descended toward engagement altitude, 700 yards, 600, 500. The bomber crew had spotted his approach and was taking evasive action, but the commander's radio discipline remained perfect. Still coordinating with other aircraft, still maintaining operational control, still directing an attack designed to maximize American casualties. At 400 yards, Thornfield fired, 3-second burst, 72 rounds. The shells converged on the bomber's left engine and wing structure. Metal sparkled as 20-millimeter rounds found their target, but the bomber didn't explode, didn't catch fire, didn't enter the death spiral typical of aircraft hit in fuel tanks. Armored bomber, or at least a bomber with self-sealing fuel tanks and reinforced structure. Military version, rather than the civilian transport aircraft Japan often converted for bombing operations. The command aircraft had no improvised conversion. It was purpose-built for combat operations, which explained how its commander had survived long enough to develop the tactical sophistication demonstrated tonight. The bomber continued its evasive maneuvers, now trailing smoke from its damaged engine but still flying, still maneuverable, still dangerous, and still coordinating with other aircraft through radio communication that remained clear and professional despite combat damage. Thornfield pursued through the bomber's defensive turns, burning fuel at maximum consumption rates but maintaining radar contact. The Japanese commander was good, very good, but he was flying damaged aircraft against a pilot who'd spent 18 years learning that wounded prey often revealed weaknesses when pressed beyond their limits. At 300 yards, he fired again, 4-second burst, 96 rounds. This time, the shells tore through the bomber's cockpit area and right engine. Fire erupted from both engines, spreading across the wing surfaces. The aircraft rolled inverted and entered a steep dive, streaming flame and debris. But even as the bomber fell, Thornfield's radio crackled with the final transmission from the Japanese commander. Voice, calm, professional, undefeated despite certain death. Well flown, American pilot. You have tactical skill worthy of respect. But this engagement was intelligence gathering, not strategic attack. The information gathered tonight will be used against your people many times. Remember this when you count tonight's victories. The transmission ended as the burning bomber hit the ocean 3 miles east of Muro Field. But the commander's final words carried implications that made Thornfield's funeral home instincts crawl with dread. Intelligence gathering, information for future use. Tonight's engagement had been designed from the beginning as a learning exercise, with American deaths as acceptable costs for gathering tactical intelligence about P-61 operations. Every decision he'd made, every response pattern he'd demonstrated, every tactical preference he'd revealed had been recorded and would be used to kill other American pilots in future engagements. The Japanese commander had achieved his primary objective even while losing his own life. The fuel gauge showed 47%. The radio showed continued emergency traffic from ground control, reporting bomber attacks throughout the airfield complex, casualties mounting, and construction equipment destroyed. The reserve bombers had completed their mission while he pursued the command aircraft. Immediate tactical victory combined with strategic failure, exactly the outcome the Japanese commander had planned. But tactical victories accumulated into strategic advantages if you understood their implications correctly. Thornfield had eliminated the intelligence directing tonight's attack and learned valuable information about Japanese night bombing capabilities, command structures, and tactical innovations. Information that could be used to save American lives in future engagements. More importantly, he'd learned that someone in the Japanese Night Fighter Command understood American psychology well enough to design attacks that exploited emotional responses rather than purely tactical considerations. That knowledge would be crucial for training other night fighter pilots to recognize and counter similar psychological manipulation. The radio crackled with ground control. Night Hunter 1, emergency fuel check. Reserve bombers have withdrawn. Construction crews report heavy casualties, but airfield operations continue. Advise fuel status for continued patrol. Thornfield checked his gauges, 43% fuel remaining. Enough for 30 minutes of patrol time or immediate return to base with standard reserves, but the reserve bombers had withdrawn rather than being destroyed, which meant they could return when American defenses relaxed. Ground control, Night Hunter 1, showing 43% fuel, continuing patrol for 30 minutes, then returning to base. Copy, Night Hunter 1. Be advised, construction crews report 12 killed, 31 wounded, significant equipment damage, but airfield completion still possible within the invasion timeline. Your intercepts prevented total mission failure. 12 dead, 31 wounded. Americans who'd been building runways for fighters that would end the war, killed by bombers coordinated by a commander intelligent enough to use their deaths as psychological weapons. The weight of those numbers settled in Thornfield's chest, like the familiar ache he'd carried during his funeral home years, when families brought him bodies and expected him to make death look peaceful. But 12 dead was better than the hundreds who would have died if all bombers had reached their targets. And 31 wounded would recover to build more airfields, support more invasions, and contribute to ending the war that had brought Japanese bombers to Philippine skies. Survival wasn't measured in perfect victories. It was measured in keeping enough people alive to continue the mission. Thornfield continued his patrol for 28 minutes, scanning for any sign of returning bombers, but the night remained clear. At 41% fuel, he turned toward Muro Field and began his approach for landing. The runway lights were visible from 5 miles out, steady white beacons that marked safety and survival for one more night. As he descended toward the airfield, Thornfield could see the aftermath of the bombing attack. Fires burning in the fuel storage area, ambulances moving between damaged construction equipment, crews working to clear debris and resume airfield completion. The work continued despite casualties, exactly as the Japanese commander had predicted. American determination, combined with American industrial capacity, immune to tactical setbacks that would have stopped less resourceful opponents. The P-61 touched down at 0:43, 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Thornfield taxied to the hardstand and shut down engines, then climbed out of the cockpit to face the ground crew who'd watched the entire engagement on radar. Technical Sergeant Williams approached with fuel consumption calculations and ammunition expenditure reports. Major, we tracked 5 confirmed kills, 3 probable, and complete disruption of coordinated attack. Construction Chief reports airfield completion delayed 48 hours, but still within the invasion timeline. 5 kills. In his funeral home days, Thornfield would have called that a successful night's work. 5 problems solved, 5 sources of future difficulty eliminated. But the problems had been aircraft carrying human beings, and the solutions had required killing people who probably had families, careers, dreams that would never be fulfilled. Any intelligence gathered from radio intercepts? Thornfield asked. Yes, sir. Communications analysis identified command aircraft broadcasting on multiple frequencies, coordinating with ground stations and other aircraft. Professional discipline, sophisticated tactics, definitely not improvised operations. Which confirmed what Thornfield had suspected. Tonight's engagement had been planned by someone with extensive training in night bombing operations, probably someone with access to intelligence about American defensive capabilities. Someone who'd studied P-61 tactics specifically and developed countermeasures designed to exploit known weaknesses. Major, one more thing, Williams continued. Japanese radio traffic included references to Ghost Hunter and instructions to avoid night engagements with P-61 aircraft. Sounds like they're starting to fear our night fighter operations. Ghost Hunter, fear of night fighters, psychological impact extending beyond immediate tactical results. The Japanese commander's intelligence gathering had worked both ways. While learning American tactical preferences, he'd also revealed Japanese concerns about radar-equipped fighters operating in darkness they'd previously controlled. Fear was a tactical advantage that accumulated over time, making future operations easier as enemy pilots became reluctant to engage or operate with reduced aggression. In his funeral homework, Thornfield had observed that criminals who feared detection often made mistakes that led to capture. Fear changed decision-making patterns, created hesitation, and compromised operational effectiveness. The Japanese were beginning to fear something they couldn't see, couldn't predict, couldn't counter with conventional tactics. They were beginning to fear the ghost in the Black Widow. Over the following months, reports filtered back through intelligence channels about Japanese bomber crews requesting fighter escorts for night operations, avoiding areas known to have P-61 coverage, abbreviating missions to minimize exposure to radar-equipped fighters. The psychological impact of night fighter operations was undermining Japanese confidence in their ability to control darkness. By February 1945, Japanese night bombing operations in the Philippines had declined 70% from pre-P-61 levels. American construction projects proceeded without interruption. The Lingayen Gulf invasion succeeded ahead of schedule, supported by airfields completed without further bombing interference. The war ended in August 1945, and Major Atticus Thornfield returned to Vermont in November. He took over Blackwood & Sons funeral home from his father and resumed the business of making death look peaceful for grieving families. He never discussed his combat record, never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs about hunting bombers in Philippine darkness. The only indication of his wartime service was a small photograph on his office wall showing a P-61 Black Widow parked on a coral runway. Visitors assumed it was generic military memorabilia. They didn't know it showed the aircraft that had hunted 4 bombers in 80 minutes and earned the fear of every Japanese pilot who flew night missions in the Pacific Theater. Local veterans occasionally recognized him at memorial services, but they respected his privacy and never spoke publicly about what they knew. In small Vermont towns, some secrets were kept simply because keeping them honored the men who'd carried burdens too heavy for public discussion. Thornfield continued operating the funeral home until his death in 1987, 42 years after the war ended. His obituary in the Montpelier Examiner mentioned his service as a night fighter pilot, but provided no details about specific operations or achievements. The newspaper's editor was a veteran who understood that some stories belonged to the men who'd lived them. But in military archives, intelligence reports, and squadron histories, the record remained. Major Atticus Thornfield, 428 night fighter missions, 17 confirmed kills, credited with establishing psychological dominance over Japanese night bombing operations in the Philippines theater. The mortician's son who'd learned to read death patterns had taught enemy pilots to fear the darkness they'd once controlled. Major Atticus Thornfield proved that our darkest gifts can become our greatest strengths in service of others. If this forgotten hero story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. These warriors deserve to be remembered for the lives they saved in the shadows. The P-61 Black Widow he'd flown was scrapped after the war, along with most aircraft of its type. No museum displays commemorate the night fighters who hunted bombers in Pacific darkness, but in the small cemetery behind Blackwood & Sons funeral home, a simple gravestone marks the resting place of the man who'd protected sleeping Americans from death that approached on silent wings. The inscription reads simply, Atticus Thornfield, 1918 to 1987, beloved son and mortician. No mention of wings, warfare, or the nights when he'd been the ghost that Japanese pilots learned to fear. Just the quiet acknowledgement that he'd spent his life helping others face death with dignity, whether in funeral parlors or fighter cockpits. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who never seek recognition for their victories. Sometimes the greatest heroes are those who understand death well enough to prevent it from claiming the innocent. And sometimes the darkness that seems like curse becomes the gift that saves thousands of lives sleeping safely below. In the archives of the 418th Night Fighter Squadron, a single line entry records December 29, 1944. Major A. Thornfield, solo intercept mission, 12 enemy aircraft engaged, 5 confirmed destroyed, airfield operations preserved. 43 words that summarize 80 minutes of combat but reveal nothing about the mortician's son who learned to hunt death itself. Today, commercial aircraft cross Philippine skies where Japanese bombers once threatened sleeping Americans. Passengers never know that their peaceful journey traces the exact flight path of a man who turned his darkest gift into salvation for thousands he would never personally meet.